The stories. Paramedic who kept one final snapshot. The story began with a photo that shouldn't have existed. A single Polaroid, slightly overexposed, showing the inside of an ambulance during a call that supposedly never happened. It was discovered years later, tucked between the pages of an old medical manual in a small-town fire station's archive. The man behind that photo was Martin Kessler, a 42-year-old paramedic who'd spent nearly 2 decades working in a quiet coastal county. He was the kind of person people trusted instantly, steady hands, calm voice, always first on scene and last to leave. Colleagues said he never forgot a face, even from calls years earlier. That photographic memory made the irony of what happened next impossible to ignore. In late March of 2012, Martin and his partner, Dana Ruiz, responded to a dispatch from a stretch of highway north of town. A rollover accident, single vehicle, one driver, reportedly conscious but trapped. The log shows they arrived at 2:17 a.m. Weather clear, visibility decent. Everything about the report was ordinary. Until it wasn't. When firefighters reached the car, there was no one inside. Seatbelt unbuckled, airbags deployed, engine still ticking from heat, no footprints in the gravel shoulder, no sign of struggle. Dana's field notes mention Martin standing there longer than anyone, staring into the dark beyond the guardrail, as if waiting for something to move. He didn't say much on the drive back, just, "It doesn't feel right. Someone was here." The next morning, Martin called the dispatcher, asking for the driver's name. There wasn't one. The system had registered the call as civilian report unknown source. No, 911 record existed, only a radio relay from a patrol unit that later denied making it. That was when Martin started keeping a notebook part medical log, part journal. He filled it with incident details that didn't make sense, addresses that didn't appear on maps, names that changed between shift reports, an emergency call from a decommissioned nursing home that had burned down 5 years earlier. Dana joked it was his ghost file, but Martin treated it like evidence. In mid-April, station archives show him requesting a portable camera from inventory, the kind still used for accident documentation. He said he wanted backups for reports. No one questioned it. That camera became the source of the one photo that remains. On May 5th, Martin responded alone to a cardiac distress call in a residential neighborhood. The official dispatch recorded a woman named Eleanor Marsh, age 71. When Dana arrived 15 minutes later, the house was empty. No patient, no signs of struggle, only Martin sitting on the front steps, shaking. He told her he'd just finished chest compressions, but there was no body. That evening, he turned in a sealed envelope to the station chief. Inside, a single Polaroid showing an elderly woman on a stretcher inside the ambulance. Her face pale but peaceful, IV line in her arm, heart monitor reading a steady rhythm. The timestamp on the photo matched the call, yet no hospital in the region logged a patient by that name, and the ambulance's GPS data placed it in the station lot at the time. For weeks, the department treated it as a data glitch, a wrong timestamp, maybe a mistaken upload. Martin, however, stopped taking calls entirely. He used his accumulated leave and disappeared from the rotation. Dana later said he'd started visiting the county records office, spending hours looking through missing persons reports from the 1990s onward. According to the clerk's statement, he requested files on one case repeatedly. A local woman, 71 years old, who'd vanished from her home in May of 1996. Her name, Eleanor Marsh. She'd been last seen the same week a younger Martin had begun his EMT training in that same county. What tied them together came from an old photograph Martin found in the file. It showed a group of EMT trainees standing beside a vintage ambulance. On the far left, a younger Martin smiling awkwardly. On the far right, a woman in a white nurse's uniform, Eleanor, back when she'd volunteered with the training program. Her sudden disappearance had never been solved. The case quietly closed after 3 years. The evidence stacking grew stranger. In late May, an internal audit found Martin had accessed archived radio frequencies from the old dispatch system equipment retired in 1999. He'd been trying to trace the source of that first mysterious accident call. Logs showed someone or something still transmitting on that outdated frequency once every few nights, always repeating the same brief phrase, medic en route. By early June, Martin returned to work briefly, though he looked exhausted, his once steady hands trembling. He told Dana he thought the woman from the Polaroid had been trying to reach him for years, that all the phantom calls were echoes of old emergencies, looping through time until someone finally answered. She begged him to take time off again, but he refused. "If I stop listening," he said, "they'll stop trying to come home." The last confirmed sighting of Martin Kessler was on June 15th of that year. Surveillance footage from a rural gas station shows him fueling the ambulance alone, headlights off, before driving north toward the old highway. The timestamp reads 2:17 a.m., the exact minute of the original rollover call. 3 days later, the ambulance was found parked beside a defunct rest stop, keys still in the ignition. The driver's side door was open, the radio turned to static. In the back compartment, responders discovered a single Polaroid camera lying on the gurney. It contained one undeveloped sheet of film. That image was later processed by the state lab. It showed the inside of the ambulance, empty except for a stretcher, with two folded paramedic jackets placed neatly side by side. The back doors stood open, facing a foggy stretch of road. The official report labeled Martin Kessler missing, presumed deceased. No further transmissions were logged from the old frequency. The firehouse quietly retired his call sign, and the Polaroid was sealed in evidence storage, tagged simply, "Recovered from Unit 7, June 15, 2012. Years later, when new recruits asked about him, veterans would point to the framed photo on the wall, the one of Martin and Dana receiving their service award in 2010. Behind the glass, barely visible under the reflection of overhead lights, there's a faint double exposure. The outline of an ambulance interior, doors open, a stretcher waiting. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. The snapshot was real, the patient never existed, and somewhere along that forgotten highway, a paramedic might have finally answered a call meant only for him. The stories. Night guard who logged footsteps, no camera recorded. The night it happened, the security office at the old Westmore shipping depot smelled like dust and burnt coffee. According to shift logs, a 42-year-old guard named Dennis Halbrook clocked in at 11:30 p.m. and wrote a short note. Asterisk. Routine patrol. Clear floor. Humid tonight. Asterisk. He was the only guard on duty. By dawn, his chair was empty, his flashlight was lying under the main stairwell, and the building's cameras, 8 of them, showed nothing from the hours between midnight and 2. Westmore had been a Rust Belt landmark since the late 1970s, a concrete maze of loading bays and silent conveyor belts on the edge of a quiet Midwestern town. Dennis had worked there for 7 years, divorced, reliable, usually quiet. The kind of man who showed up early and read old paperbacks during breaks. That night was supposed to be uneventful, just a standard walkthrough before the building was scheduled for renovation. Around 12:10, he logged a line in the duty notebook kept beside the monitor screens. Asterisk. Footsteps on mezzanine catwalk, west wing. Checked cams, no feed, asterisk. A minute later, asterisk. Still hearing it, will inspect, asterisk. That was the last thing he ever wrote. The plant's internal system backed up video every 6 hours. When investigators reviewed the footage from the mezzanine camera, the feed cut to static precisely at 12:08. Other cameras kept recording fine until 2:30, showing only flickering lights and empty halls. A maintenance worker named Harold Cortez arrived early that morning to replace fluorescent tubes on the ground level. He found Dennis's flashlight lying on its side, beam still weakly glowing, and the notebook open. No sign of struggle, no torn fabric, no blood. Just footprints, 2 sets tracked faintly through the dust. One set from Dennis's standard issue boots, the other, smaller, bare, leading to the freight elevator that hadn't worked in months. The county sheriff's department filed the case as a missing person. Official notes cited malfunctioning surveillance and probable equipment interference. But people who'd worked there doubted the malfunction explanation. Westmore's night tech, a woman named Carla Wynn, swore she'd serviced those cameras the previous week. They were old, but fine, she told local reporters. The cables were intact. You can't lose a feed that clean unless someone cuts power at the board. Dennis's sister, a nurse named Ruth, said he'd called her the night before. He'd sounded distracted, mentioning he'd found a second badge lying by the locker room door. She assumed he meant another guard's ID, but the company only issued one active credential, his. Archived building logs later showed the same badge used twice that night, once when Dennis clocked in, again at 12:11, opening the West Wing stairwell door. Whoever used it the second time moved toward the mezzanine exactly where Dennis had gone to investigate. By late summer of 2014, the company shut down the depot and cleared out the interior. Cleanup crews unearthed a small personal cassette recorder near a ventilation shaft behind the third bay. It contained about 30 seconds of audio, the hum of lights, a pair of quick footsteps, a metallic clank, then Dennis's voice saying, "Who's up there?" followed by a short distortion burst and silence. Audio engineers confirmed the tape had been magnetically warped, likely by exposure to a strong field, not heat or age. There was another strange detail buried in the sheriff's supplementary report, a mention of radio interference in patrol channels between 12 and 12:30. The on-call dispatcher logged fragments of words bleeding through static asterisk. Northgate, lights out, he's still here. Asterisk, none of the other guards were on duty that night, and the next scheduled patrol wasn't until morning. Years later, a local journalist named Owen Ralston revisited the case for a regional history program. He interviewed former employees and found that in 1998, 2 decades earlier, another guard, 39-year-old Gerald Pike, had disappeared during overnight maintenance. Same mezzanine, same missing camera footage, same unexplained power surge. Back then, the report blamed faulty wiring. Ralston tracked down Gerald's surviving son, who showed him an old Polaroid his father had taken before the disappearance. The photo captured the West Wing catwalk at night, lights flickering in the distance. In the lower right corner, partially blurred, was a faint silhouette that seemed to be looking down at whoever held the camera. Analysts couldn't verify whether it was a reflection or a person. But when the journalist compared the layout of that image with modern floor plans, he noticed something: the angle matched exactly where Dennis's flashlight was later found. What made it worse, the timestamp written in blue ink on the Polaroid's border, asterisk, the 3rd of April 1998, 12:11 M asterisk, was identical to the digital record of Dennis's badge swipe, asterisk 12:11 M asterisk, 2 men, 16 years apart, logged in the same minute of the hour, in the same corridor, just before both vanished. Electrical engineers consulted during Ralston's project suggested a pattern of ground faults that might have caused rolling blackouts localized to one wing, possibly scrambling old analog video circuits. It could explain the synchronized failures, but they couldn't explain how both guards' ID logs and physical traces pointed to motion beyond any camera's field. In late autumn of 2021, the depot site was finally demolished. Before the demolition, a volunteer archivist named Leah Torres cataloged remaining items from the security office for the county museum. Inside a rusted filing cabinet, she found the original duty notebook sealed in a plastic evidence bag. Most pages were smudged, but the last line stood clear under the dried ink. Asterisk. Still hearing it. Will inspect. Asterisk. Beneath it, barely visible under a tilt of light, another faint line appeared, impressed by pen pressure, not ink. Forensic enhancement later revealed, asterisk, recording this time. Asterisk. That phrase matched an unfiled cassette found near Dennis's locker years earlier, the same type used for the warped tape. The archivist played it carefully on a restored deck. The audio was faint, but at the 13-second mark came what experts described as a pattern of steps, counted 7, then stop. The acoustics placed it roughly 10 feet above the ground, consistent with the mezzanine. When news of the find resurfaced, Ralston added an epilogue to his documentary. He pointed out that both the 1998 and 2014 incidents shared one quiet constant. The security logs always mentioned footsteps, but never the echo that should have followed in a steel-floored building. He speculated that the mezzanine's partial collapse during construction years earlier created a space that resonated oddly, bending sound in ways the old analog recorders couldn't track. Maybe, he said in the closing narration, what Dennis heard wasn't someone walking, but the building replaying itself. The official record lists Dennis Halbrook as missing, presumed deceased. No remains were ever found. The West Wing mezzanine was melted down with the rest of the metal. Today, the old depot grounds are a parking lot for long-haul trucks. Drivers who park overnight sometimes mention hearing boots pacing above the asphalt when the wind picks up, though there's nothing there, just open sky. Local radio traffic still gets random interference near mile marker 32, short bursts that resemble a steady rhythm of footsteps. At this point, the facts that remained were simple. Two guards, years apart, logged the same minute, heard the same sound, and left no image behind. The rest, whatever it was, stayed between the missing frames of a camera that never recorded and a notebook line that never should have been there. The stories. This dispatcher flagged a warning nobody else heard. In the summer of 2015, a small county dispatch center in the Midwest logged what should have been another quiet night routine calls, minor accidents, nothing serious. But at 2:36 a.m., dispatcher Lorna Keats flagged a single line in the call log with a red warning tag. The rest of the shift didn't notice. 12 hours later, a missing person report came in from the same road. Lorna was 52, a mother of 3, and one of the few veteran dispatchers still working nights. She'd spent more than 20 years listening to the county breathe through static. Drunk drivers, runaway teens, distant gunshots that usually turned out to be fireworks. That night, she was scheduled to train a new hire, Evan Rhodes, a quiet 20-something fresh out of community college. He remembered her as calm, methodical someone who double-checked even the quiet calls. The call in question lasted just 19 seconds. It came from an unregistered prepaid cell phone traced to the stretch of County Route 47 between mile markers 19 and 20. The caller didn't say much, just a breathy male voice repeating, "He's still here," before the line cut. Background noise? Steady hum, maybe an engine, maybe wind? Lorna replayed the audio 3 times, then filed it under possible domestic disturbance. But something made her stop the recording and reopen it. According to her later statement, she heard a faint ticking sound under the voice mechanical, uneven. Like a turn signal that never clicked off, she said. At 2:38, she added a note, "Warning possible vehicle hazard, County 47. No one responded. The patrol car assigned to that region had already been rerouted to a stranded motorist 15 miles away. The shift ended at 6, and by the next day, the flag was buried beneath dozens of other overnight notes. 2 days later, a farmer found a truck half submerged in a drainage ditch along the same stretch of road. Inside was 30-year-old Bradley Norham, a construction worker from a nearby town. Engine still idling, phone missing, seatbelt unlatched. Coroner placed the time of death around 2:40 that same morning, within minutes of Lorna's flagged call. County investigators wrote it up as a single-vehicle accident. They said Bradley likely swerved to avoid a deer, hit the embankment, and drowned before he could escape. Lorna, however, couldn't let it go. She'd handled too many wrecks to ignore the timing. The ticking sound, the phrase, "he's still here," the untraceable number, it didn't add up. A week later, she retrieved the audio from archive storage and took it home on a thumb drive. Her husband found her replaying it that evening, headphones pressed tight, not speaking for almost an hour. She said she thought she heard 2 different voices, one layered under the main one. A whisper, or maybe a radio echo, she told him. He dismissed it as interference, but Lorna wasn't satisfied. She called the phone company listed in the report, Westridge Cellular, to ask about prepaid tower logs. The representative told her the call had pinged off a repeater near Old Mill Road, 2 miles east of the crash. Problem was, that tower had been offline for maintenance between midnight and 3 a.m. She double-checked through county records. The outage was confirmed. If that was true, The call shouldn't have connected at all. When she brought this to her supervisor, he told her it wasn't her concern. The system hiccups sometimes, he said. Let it go. Instead, she filed a quiet memo through the internal server detailing her findings and sent a copy to a friend in the State Highway Patrol. The friend, Officer Miriam Cole, kept the note, but admitted later she didn't think much of it until months afterward. Then, in November of that year, a storm knocked out power across the same district. During the outage, technicians discovered a repeater box still running from an auxiliary generator, a model decommissioned years earlier. Inside it was a burned SIM card fused into the port. Serial number partially visible. It matched the first digits of the untraceable phone from Lorna's warning. This detail never made the official report. A small internal inquiry followed, but concluded there was no functional link between the repeater malfunction and any known incident. By that point, Lorna had already transferred to a day shift. She told coworkers she didn't want to hear the night anymore. Years later, a regional journalist researching abandoned communication systems stumbled on the archived memo. The journalist, Alan Marin, interviewed Lorna at her kitchen table in 2020. By then, she'd retired and moved to a smaller town near the river. In the recording, which he later shared for a local podcast, she said something quietly that caught his attention. You know what gets me? He said. He's still here. Not, I'm still here. Someone else was supposed to hear it. Alan followed the breadcrumb trail dispatch logs, weather reports, the crash file, and that malfunctioning repeater. He found that the generator inside had been serviced twice after its supposed decommission date, each time by a subcontractor called Northspan Utilities. Northspan had folded in 2013, 2 years before the incident. Whoever maintained that repeater after the shutdown wasn't listed in county records. Alan managed to contact one former Northspan technician, a man named Dennis Harlow. Dennis said that in the early 2000s, some repeaters were used to piggyback maintenance frequencies for nearby rail lines. It was a cheap way to test emergency signals, he said. But it was never supposed to overlap with civilian channels. If it did, you'd get bleed-through, like ghost calls. Ghost calls. That term caught traction online when Alan's podcast aired, though Lorna hated it. She said the word ghost turned it into superstition, not signal bleed, not malfunction. Still, she admitted the possibility haunted her. The crash site, the voice, the timestamp, they lined up too neatly. In 2021, the county repaved Route 47, covering the drainage ditch. The wreckage was long removed, but for maintenance training, new dispatchers were still shown the red-flagged log from that night as a case study in procedural diligence. The warning nobody else heard became a quiet legend among the staff, half cautionary tale, half proof of how easily small details slip away. What remained were fragments: the 19-second clip archived under a generic file name, the memo Lorna wrote, the service invoices from Northspan, and the coroner's note listing water in the lungs. Each on its own could mean nothing. Together, they formed a pattern too odd to ignore but too thin to prove. Lorna passed away in 2023. At her retirement gathering the year before, a few old colleagues brought up the story. She just smiled and said, "It was probably static." Then, according to Evan, her trainee from that night, she added quietly, "But static comes from somewhere." At this point, the facts that remained were simple. One call, one warning, one man dead on a dark county road. The system logged everything perfectly except for the truth behind that 19-second window. Whether it was interference, a misrouted test frequency, or something else, no one could ever show exactly who made that call or why it stopped where it did. Still, in the dispatch training manual filed a few years later, there's a footnote beside Lorna's case study. It reads, "Always listen twice before you clear a line." No capital letters, no bold text, just quiet advice embedded between procedural codes. A reminder that sometimes the sound we dismiss as noise might be the only signal that matters. The stories. Night Guard, who followed footprints beyond the bridge. The first prints showed on a cold night when the river smoked and the closed bridge let out a slow iron groan. Frost held the gravel in a crust, so every step someone took across the municipal yard snapped like thin glass. Merrick Holland worked nights because he liked quiet places and because the warehouse paid overtime when storms rolled in. He was 41 by the last week of January, and he kept his thermos on the dash while he did his rounds. His plan was simple that night. Check the north fence. Check the generator shed. Sign the log before dawn and head home on the empty road. He saw the prints on his second pass, and their path made little sense when he stood still to study them. The footprints curved toward the pedestrian bridge that crossed the narrow river, which had been closed since late autumn while crews waited on parts. A chain-link panel barred the entrance with a sign that warned about unsafe decking, and Marek knew the sign by heart. He radioed the dispatcher with a routine note, since procedure made repeaters of careful guards. He kept his words easy. He said there were footprints where there should be none, and that he would check closer. The reply was scratchy and bored, and Merrick almost laughed at the familiar tone. The treads were small and tidy, like work boots with a diamond pattern, and each step pressed the frost to a dark oval. The prints went right up to the chain-link panel, then slipped under at a low spot where someone had pulled wire loose. Merrick knelt and touched the ground, and cold shot through his glove while he reset the bent ties. He peered down the dark shape of the bridge and decided he would not walk out there in the cold wind, not without telling someone first. He called again, then kept his flashlight tight to the decking while he stepped forward, and he felt the bridge vibrate under his boots. He moved slow because he always moved slow when he could choose between slow and fast. Halfway across, the prints turned to powder as the frost thinned, and he had to scan both sides for scuffs on the gray boards. He found a faint line where grit had dragged, like something heavy had been pulled by rope. On the far side, the deck ended at a set of concrete steps that dropped to the river path, and here the prints deepened again. They pointed left, past an old pipe cradle and a low stand of scrub willow. Reports in the fall had mentioned fissures along the bank after hours, which was normal, and a few had been moved along without trouble. A clerk at the gas station had told an officer that a man bought batteries and duct tape in the same visit, which was normal enough, though people sometimes remember strange details when asked at night. Dispatch logs showed power dips near the intake station from time to time, and maintenance had chalked that up to loose connections in cold weather. Marek followed the prints along the river path until they vanished near a patch of bare gravel that the sun struck most days, even in winter. He stood there and listened. Somewhere upstream, an owl made 3 soft calls, and a semi rolled past on the highway with a roar that shook the willow branches. He decided he had gone far enough for one night. He photographed the prints on his phone and headed back, and he wrote a careful note in the log before dawn. By the next shift, the frost lifted late, and the yard lights burned a clean white circle on the gravel. Merrick checked the generator shed first and noticed something he could not shake. The small lock on the diesel cap was scuffed, and a scratch ran from the cap to the lip like a hose had rubbed while someone steadied a weight. He checked the fuel slip from the last delivery and did the quick math. The level looked low by a few gallons, which could happen, and which also could not. He spoke with Celia Karp in maintenance the following afternoon because Celia knew more about the place than anyone in the office. Celia was 58 and had worked 3 floods and 2 droughts, and she kept a pocket notebook with every code for every panel. She said the power dips had been shrugged off by city, and that nobody had time to pull the panels until spring. She said the bridge closure made her nervous because blocked paths invite shortcuts. On the 3rd night, Marek went to the bridge before his first pass, and he crouched at the chain-link panel with a small bag of sidewalk chalk from the supply closet. He rubbed a pinch of red chalk into the dirt under the gap and dusted the decking where the prints had scuffed before. He wanted a way to tell if someone crossed again, and he wanted to see where the dust went when the night did its work. He made his rounds slower than usual and kept his eyes on corners where things hide without trying. The radio remained quiet until midnight. Then a call came in about a coyote by the south gate. Marek drove down and found only wind, and he thought the call felt like a joke he had heard before. He logged it anyway, because logs are the bones of quiet jobs. When he returned to the bridge, his light caught the faintest red sunset on the boards, and he felt alert in the way he liked. The chalk had smeared in a thin line toward the far steps, and the dust trailed down to the river path. On the gravel, small red flecks marked an arc that led behind a stack of old culvert pipe where few people bothered to look. He moved closer and found a cooler wedged inside a culvert mouth, and an inverter buzzed inside like a tired hornet. A length of clear hose lay coiled by the cooler, and the nozzle had a strip of duct tape where a leak had been patched. The setup looked temporary and careful, like someone trusted routine more than luck. Marek called dispatch, and his voice stayed even while he chose words that would not set hairs on necks. An officer drove down the service road and met him by the culvert, and they stood and listened together. The officer did not rush, which Marek respected, and the two men watched the bridge until the wind shifted. The officer said he would put a note on the morning brief, and he asked Marek to keep eyes open without playing hero. The phrase made Marek smile, and later he did not tell that part to anyone. In the days after, Marek traced the quiet pattern that repeats when someone abuses access. He checked camera angles and discovered the North Yard camera had been bumped on a date that matched a power dip, and the new angle showed the sky more than the gate. He opened the back of the housing and found 3 screws missing, which was always a tell. He measured the footprints with a scrap of tape and got the same length each time, which told him the walker was careful with steps or else was one person always. He walked to the diner 2 blocks away during the afternoon and chatted with the cook named Huxley, who knew every vehicle that rolled through after midnight. Huxley said a man in a dark jacket sat late 2 nights a week, always with a single cup of coffee and a pocket radio on the booth seat. Huxley said the man tipped exact change and left when the freight trains crossed the river, which happened near the time Marion Street patrol cars swapped shifts. At the yard, a temporary guard from an agency had been filling 2 nights that Mark traded away for overtime on weekends. The temp signed the log with 2 letters and a quick crooked line. The initials were H and P, which matched about 1,000 people and which could match none. Marek did not care for suspicion as a hobby, yet he did not care for coincidences when fuel levels fell in quiet inches. He sat in his sedan before shift and went through old notes in his glove box where he kept manuals and photocopies. A contractor named Deacon Varelli had lost access in 2017 after a billing fight, and his crew had worked the intake station on that very river path for years. Marek wrote the name on a small card, then tossed the card at once, because names can lead you down the wrong hall. He kept his attention on the temp schedule instead, and he compared logs against the chalk nights and the reported coyote calls. On a dry Tuesday, red chalk showed again on the gravel, and the cooler in the culvert had moved 2 feet, which looked like a nervous person trying to outsmart the obvious. Marek called the non-emergency number and asked for a quiet presence, and officers waited with their lights low behind the old salt shed. Marek did his rounds with wide loops and checked his watch without seeming to check, and he waited on the near side of the bridge by the chain link panel. A figure came over the crest like a shadow that had business, and the boots set down in precise little ovals. The man wore a dark jacket with reflective piping like the agency issued, and he carried a duffel that sagged from weight. Marek stepped forward and kept his light on the ground, and he spoke steady without trying to sound like an actor. He said the bridge was closed by order of city, and he asked if help was needed. The man froze and looked left toward the culvert, which told Marek the only thing he really needed to know. The officers stepped from behind the shed, and everything stayed dull and true from there. The duffel held a 12-volt pump, a power bank, and 2 hoses cut to different lengths. The cooler held the inverter and spare tape and a stack of empty hand warmers, which can keep batteries alive just long enough between dips. The generator diesel cap carried the same tape residue as the hose, which tied the loop neatly enough for any careful mind. In the report that later circulated, details sat plain without flourish, which is how such documents talk to the world. The temp guard was named Harley Pruitt, age 36, and he had worked a roster of small night jobs that rewarded boredom more than skill. Archived calls showed he had reported animal movement at the south gate on the nights when the pump likely ran, which kept eyes away from the river path. Store security footage from across the highway reportedly showed a man matching his build, buying duct tape and batteries on a schedule that matched power dips at the intake station. Celia came down with a wrench the following morning and replaced the generator cap, and she tightened every panel on every camera while humming through her teeth. She shook Merrick's hand with hard gratitude, and she told him the things she always tells the new ones. Quiet places are never empty, and attention is the difference between a close call and a cleanup. People in town talked for a day, and then they talked about weather and games and a boat stuck on the ramp. Merrick logged his shift and ran a cloth across the dusty dash, and he looked once at the bridge where the chain link panel still hung crooked. He felt a small weight lift, which felt almost like pride, and then he felt something more like relief. He went back to the prints in his head, and he ran the path out again from the first night to the last. The steps had led beyond the bridge in the way tracks tell their whole story, and the red chalk had given him a quiet mouth. He thought about the way a small problem can hide inside a larger closure, and how a closed bridge invites someone to think rules are only suggestion. He drove the empty road home before dawn, and the river threw thin fog across the low bend like quiet breath. Merrick did not decide to keep working nights forever, and he did not make any grand vow. He thought instead about the small habits that keep a place honest, and the way a single set of prints can reveal a patient plan. In a town that prefers routine, a careful person with time can pull things apart slowly, unless another careful person keeps watch and asks simple questions that carry weight. By spring, the bridge opened again with new planks that smelled like fresh-cut pine, and families leaned on the rail to watch geese slide by. Some people remember a rumor when they cross, while most only hear water and light traffic and the chatter of kids. Merrick crosses when his route calls for it, and he never looks for drama, though he notices scuffs out of habit and checks if gates sit straight. He keeps chalk in the glove box still, and he keeps a small card that reminds him that attention wins more often than luck. The card does not carry a name, and it does not need one, because the lesson was simple and dull and true. He followed footprints beyond a bridge that everyone ignored, and he found a tidy machine made for taking small pieces of a place that trusted silence. Quiet work gave him back a little faith, which is worth more on a night shift than any badge or speech. When people ask him why he noticed, Marek says it was the shape of the morning frost and the numbers that never add fare. He tells them he just kept walking where the prince asked him to go, and he wrote things down when they mattered. He says a bridge is still a path even when closed, and that someone will use that fact to their advantage at least once. The rest of the time, he does not say much, and he lets the town hold its small stories without fuss, because most of them end with someone paying attention and returning what does not belong to them. The cabin door that never opened in Hoonah, Alaska. Locals in Hoonah still mention a cabin off Port Frederick where a door reportedly refused to open during a search. The story circulates in marina talk and winter gatherings when icy straight winds push boats against the floats. People repeat details from memory and clipped reports, then pause when the timeline begins to blur. They say nothing supernatural happened, yet the door remains the problem everyone avoids naming. The central figure was 47, a maintenance carpenter named Richard Vale who came to Hoonah for seasonal repairs on public cabins. He carried a tidy set of tools and a habit of writing dates on masking tape inside hinge plates. His stated goal was simple work and steady pay, while his brother managed their mother's treatment in Juneau. He rented a room above the harbor office and paid cash for fuel and dry goods. According to archived notes at the city office, neighbors saw Richard wheel a cart of lumber down the boardwalk on a Wednesday. The weather held bright and cold, with early ice clinging to the shaded rocks along the shoreline. He loaded the skiff before noon and told a harbor aide he planned to check a cabin up Port Frederick by evening. The aide reportedly reminded him about a predicted squall that might arrive after nightfall. Dispatch logs from that week show routine calls for ferry coordination and a stranded truck near Game Creek. Richard's name appears once with a simple request for weather, then the line ends without a follow-up. State records list his seasonal permit and a recent renewal for small engine fuel storage. No citation or complaint mentions him before the date the cabin door enters the file. A fisherman named Caleb Norton, 58, told friends he saw a skiff hugging the inside of Crab Bay that afternoon. He pointed to a notch where wind lines rarely flatten, suggesting the operator knew how to steal quiet water. The timestamp on his phone camera places him on the float when the skiff left the harbor, Some locals claim the man at the tiller wore a bright cap, though investigators never confirmed the color. The cabin sits back from a narrow cove where spruce hides most of the shoreline from passing eyes. Its porch faces southeast and catches thin light after noon when the tide pulls weed from the rocks. Records conflict on who last signed the logbook before Richard, and the ledger paper shows a rip that obscures a date. A county file from 2009 references a similar repair visit with no noted issues. 2 days later, a guide reported a skiff tied clean at the cabin float with the bowline doubled. The fuel can sat upright and dry, which usually means no scramble during landing. The porch steps showed shallow scuffs that looked like work boots rather than soft camp shoes. A hammer rested near the threshold with tape labels cut into neat strips. When the guide tried the door, he told officers it would not open past an inch at the latch. He felt no chain, but something firm stopped it before the inward swing could clear. The windows were closed and filmed with salt, but showed no obvious shapes inside. Investigators later wrote that pry marks were absent and the hinges looked normal from the porch. A wildlife officer named Hannah Ruiz, 33, reached the site after a short run from Whitestone Harbor. She logged light surf, weak rain, and a steady outflow that pushed the skiff sideways at idle. Her notebook says the latch plate aligned true, and the strike pocket showed no splinters or shims. She wrote that sound carried strangely in the trees and seemed to return from the far bank after each shout. They removed the hinge pins and tried to lift the door straight, which should release a standard interior catch. The slab rose a thumb's width and settled again as if trapped beneath by a weight. Hannah recorded that the floor gap showed only darkness and left her uncertain if a rug wrapped the threshold. Investigators never confirmed the presence of furnishings beyond a small table noted in older maps. A second attempt used a slim wedge to feel the interior space, guided by a small light and careful hands. The wedge met resistance that felt like stacked boards or a cabinet pushed flush, though measurements failed to agree. Some locals claimed a new cabinet had been delivered that week, which warehouse staff later denied. State records include no invoice for that item under Richard's seasonal account. They circled the cabin and checked every window frame for pry damage or fresh putty that might suggest an interior brace. One corner showed a streak that looked like boot rubber near the sill, leading back toward the steps in a faint arc. The ground held little shape because rain had erased crisp edges across the duff and needles. Archived notes mention a single nail in the dirt as if dropped during fastening work. The skiff carried Richard's tool crate with tape labels on nearly every handle and bit. Inside lay screws sorted by length and a folded sheet with hinge spacing drawn in pencil. The sheet uses block letters and short words that match notes found in his bunkroom ledger. The ledger mentions a plan to replace a warped slab if the existing door failed the swing test. Hannah radioed the harbor and asked for permission to breach the wall if a medical check demanded entry. The dispatch reply reportedly advised caution because ownership paperwork listed multiple agencies with overlapping rights. They decided to leave the structure intact until a supervisor could reach the site with written clearance. That delay is the piece that people return to when they discuss what happened next. During the pause, a weather line pushed down Icy Strait and dropped sleet across the cove until evening. The boats sat heavy at their lines and the shoreline disappeared behind a sheet that blurred the trees. A loud crack came from the porch like a board shifting under new pressure inside. Caleb later told friends the sound carried across water in a clean way he did not expect from wet wood. When the team finally entered the cabin, they did not use the door that prompted the call. They took a panel off the rear wall where an old vent had been sealed with light screws. The interior smelled of resin and cold ash from a stove that held no visible ember. Notes describe a floor swept clean and a cot made with square corners beneath a wool blanket. The obstruction proved to be a cabinet frame set tight against the latch side with shims that pressed the slab inward. The frame showed careful cuts that matched Richard's tool marks and tape labels for orientation. A finish nail still held a piece of blue tape with a handwritten arrow pointing toward the jamb. The tape carried a pencil line that read "Test swing only," which introduced the hardest question in the report. If Richard built the frame for a test, he needed a partner to release the pressure from the outside when he finished. The notes do not show a second worker on the schedule, and marina staff remember no one riding with him that day. Some locals claimed he trained a part-time helper earlier that month, but investigators never confirmed a name. Records conflict on whether a volunteer crew worked that week on nearby structures. A folded jacket hung behind the stove with a badge from a Juneau supply shop sewn near the cuff. Inside a pocket, they found a receipt for fasteners and a small envelope containing 3 screws shorter than the others. The receipt date reads early in 2019, and the vendor stamp matches Richard's earlier purchases. The envelope shows a faint smear as if handled in the rain before drying on warm metal. They checked the shoreline for signs of a second skiff that could have ferried a helper away after dark. The tide range that week was broad and wiped many edges clean between morning tides. A plank floated against the weeds with a staple at one end and pieces of blue tape stuck to its side. Caleb believed it belonged to the cabinet frame, though the cut length did not match easily. The cabin journal waited on the table with 3 lines that appear in Richard's careful hand. The first lists hinge spacing and a reminder to check swell along the bottom edge before planing. The second notes a stiff turn at the latch and a light bind he planned to measure again after tea. The third reads, door doesn't open and stops short at the margin without a period. A day later, a private pilot reported a lone figure near the mouth of Game Creek carrying a coil of line. The sighting time sits close to dusk when the flats take color and distance grows hard to read. The pilot reportedly radioed a brief note, then banked toward Teneke before weather closed the gap behind. Investigators never confirmed the figure's identity, and the area held no clear prints the next morning. State records show no bank activity on Richard's account after that week, and his room key remained on a nail. His brother came from Juneau and stood on the dock while officials summarized the findings from a short clipboard. He asked whether the door frame could trap a person by accident if a shim slipped under load. The answer in the file reads unlikely, but does not fully exclude a rare bind if weight shifts after pressure. A volunteer searched the shoreline toward Spassky and found a glove caught in alder a short walk from the cove. The glove matched the brand in Richard's crate, but showed different wear along the thumb where tape leaves residue. Some locals claimed the glove looked left-handed and too small for his grip. Investigators never confirmed whether Richard owned a second pair stored in the bunkroom drawer. County file copies include a note from 2009 describing a temporary brace for a door that stuck in spring. The brace used scraps and marked measurements similar to the recent cabinet frame that blocked the latch. The old note says "remove before occupancy" in small letters with a circle drawn around the line. The circle looks faintly like Richard's habit, though the comparison is not considered conclusive. A weather station near the mouth of Port Frederick logged a short spike of gusts on the night of the first delay. The spike coincides with the loud crack reported from the porch during sleet and falling light. Technicians wrote that siding can flex under wind and shift an interior frame, a fraction that changes pressure. That explanation sits in the file beside the question of who would place the frame so precisely. When the cabin reopened months later, the door swung true after planing and a fresh coat across the slab. The cabinet pieces were stacked neatly under the porch with labels still holding to their edges. A ranger added a line to the interior log, asking future workers to avoid test braces near active latches. Visitors still run a palm along the jamb and say the swing feels heavier than it ought to feel. Richard's name remains on a list of unresolved disappearances linked to coastal communities scattered across the archipelago. The list contains notes about boats, short flights, and quiet trails that meet the water before turning inland. Officials keep the file open and accept tips that reference times and places rather than theories. People in Hoonah speak evenly about such things and prefer facts that fit inside a ledger line. Some nights, the harbor grows very still and voices travel from the fuel float to the last finger pier. A deckhand will point toward the dark shape of Port Frederick and mention the door that started with a simple test. The older hands will nod and explain that wood moves when weather presses long across the grain. Then the talk returns to ordinary work while the cove lies quiet behind the trees. The stories. Ranger station logs noted a missing hiker at noon. The radio crackled just after lunch, and the clipboard showed a blank line beside a borrowed bear spray canister. The word missing sat in block letters on the duty sheet, and the clock over the map board ticked louder than usual. Renata Vale worked the desk that week, 38, seasonal ranger with a stubborn streak for clean paperwork. The station sat outside a popular canyon where the trail ran through scrub pine, and July heat made the air taste metallic. Her plan for the day was simple: clear the lost and found shelf and call 2 vendors about water filters. Plans changed when a volunteer handed her the trail phone and said a worried brother was holding. He said his sister failed to text from the halfway point, and he used the word routine like a spell. He gave a name that did not exactly match the sign-in sheet, and his voice thinned when Renata asked about clothing and pack color. He had a screenshot of their last conversation, time-stamped just before noon, and said a ranger blog recommended checking the canyon switchbacks first. Renata felt the quiet alarm that starts in a seasoned ranger's hands, the kind that steadies rather than shakes. She called the number on the permit sticker that matched the closest name, and a voicemail box chirped with a clipped greeting. She checked the station cameras that watched the parking turnouts and found a silver sedan rolling in at 10:20. The driver wore a brimmed hat and taped the ends of the laces, a detail Renata wrote down because details age poorly when pressure arrives. The volunteer named Marco searched the trailhead kiosk for the morning log, while Renata stepped into the sun and scanned the ridge. Wind pushed dry heat across the gravel, and a jay scolded from the utility pole. She keyed dispatch and said they had a potential overdue hiker, not confirmed, and that initial checks were underway. She kept the language tight because words build momentum, and momentum brings helicopters that the budget cannot always afford. A woman in gym shorts approached with a dog and said she had heard a shout near the lower falls, short and sharp like a name. The dog sniffed the air and leaned toward the creek, then lost interest and sat her down. Renata asked about time and direction, then thanked her and pressed the note card against the map with a magnet. Witness statements fail without anchors, so she pinned the details to the grid and reviewed them aloud. Marco returned with the binder of trail camera stills that interns pulled from a motion unit near the bridge. The images showed the brimmed hat at 11:16, then again at noon on the switchback above the falls. The shirt color looked different under the dappled light, a common effect on digital stills that gave Renata a moment of doubt. She printed 2 frames and circled the pack strap, then clipped them to a clipboard for the field check. Her simple plan melted fully when dispatch called back with archived calls. A person had phoned the tip line at 11:42 and asked about trail closures on the East Rim, then hung up when asked for a callback number. The caller used a masked service that had failed before, and the audio had that empty room sound that suggested a roadside kiosk or a cheap motel. Renata pressed a knuckle against the map and agreed to log the call as related. She put together a step-by-step, starting light and staying local to the canyon. First, a hasty sweep from the bridge to the switchbacks with 1 ranger and 1 volunteer. Second, a parking lot inventory to match plates to permits and to note any vehicles with cooling engines that did not match sign-ins. Third, a witness walk with the dog owner to the lower falls, with a promise to return her to the trailhead within the hour. She radioed the plan and heard the click of acknowledgement from Wyatt Perales, 32, trail tech and steady boots in rough ground. They moved out along the creek, and the summer smell shifted from dust to algae and sunscreen. A couple in sun hats pointed to a narrow ledge where someone had left a crushed water bottle and a candy wrapper. Renata photographed the area with a department phone, then bagged the trash because trash turns into stories when the wrong eyes find it. She kept her sentences short on the radio and noted her times with a pen that left grooves deeper than the ink. At the switchback, Wyatt found boot scuffs that angled off the tread and into scrub so tight it would punish any shortcut. He pointed to a pressed patch of grass, then to a low branch with a pale scrape that matched soft plastic. Renata crouched and saw a faint thread from athletic tape, the same color she remembered from the still. The thread clung to rough bark, a small but useful tether between the images and the ground. They moved higher and reached a shallow spur where the view opened into a dry basin. On the spur, a pair of hikers said they passed a woman alone who looked back often, as if waiting for someone who never arrived. The hikers spoke slowly and paused to remember, then agreed to write brief statements at the station later that afternoon. They offered a photo from a distance that showed only a shape in heat shimmer, and the horizon looked bleached and wide. Renata asked the brother for more context by text, keeping questions narrow and practical. What snacks did she favor? Any injuries last year? And did she ever speak about this specific canyon? He replied that his sister planned the hike to test a new route from a guide forum and sent a blurry screenshot of a message board thread. A username bragged about a hidden shelf that saved 20 minutes, and that sentence pressed a new line into Renata's plan. She called the district's archive and asked for old incident notes related to the shelf, and the clerk said there were 2 minor rescues on a heat weekend 3 summers ago. Those notes described short slips and stubborn walkers and contained a detail that felt right and wrong at the same time. Both incidents started at noon when shadows shortened and depth perception failed, and both involved hikers who disliked crowds and sought quiet. Another message arrived from the brother that changed tone from worried to careful. He said a coworker reportedly spotted a silver sedan at a grocery near the highway at 1:30 with the brimmed hat visible through the windshield. He said the coworker did not want to get involved, and that felt useful in a different way. Renata thanked him and wrote the time down, then circled highway with a question mark that drew a slow breath from Wyatt. They pushed through Manzanita to reach the rumored shelf and found it narrower than described, with a crumbling margin that looked unfriendly. A faint shoe print showed a split tread that matched a popular brand, and a smear on the rock smelled like cheap bug spray. Wyatt anchored a line to a juniper and leaned just far enough to see a small alcove with shade and a clean view of the bridge. A person could wait there unseen, then return to the trail when passing groups moved on. Renata called dispatch to log the shelf and asked for a quiet check on the grocery footage if the store manager would allow it without a formal request. She kept the ask light, and the clerk at the store reportedly agreed to review only the parking lot from 1:15 to 1:45. While they waited, they spoke to a fisherman who said he had heard someone practicing a greeting near the bridge, polite and warm, the way people rehearse before calling an office. They returned to the station to regroup and found the dog owner had kept her promise about the statements. She drew a crude map of her walk and marked the spot where the shout came, which lined up with the shelf by a neat stroke. Renata checked the plate list from the lot, and one entry bothered her because the registration sticker covered an older color. That usually meant a cheap repaint, often done quickly when a car changes hands among friends. The call from the store came back while the clock swept toward 4. Footage reportedly showed a silver sedan near the outer edge, and the driver wore a brimmed hat. The camera caught the driver opening the trunk, then closing it without removing anything. The driver sat for a full minute, then left the lot with a slow signal that suggested careful timing rather than confusion. That action made less sense if a hiker was lost, and more sense if a narrative needed space. Renata asked the brother to send any recent photos of his sister's gear so they could match brands and colors to the thread on the branch. He sent a camping picture from spring, and the pack straps matched the stills with unnerving accuracy. He also sent a photo of a laminated media badge from a fitness channel and apologized for forgetting to mention that side gig. Renata stared at the badge and felt the click of pieces rubbing into place. She pulled the permit files again and found a second entry from the morning that used a near match to the name, with a transposed letter that looked accidental at first glance. The second entry had a note in different handwriting that said, "Early shoot near bridge, approved by office." The office had approved no such shoot as far as Renata knew, and a deep memory of an email warning about unauthorized product videos rose to the surface. Those videos sometimes used stage trouble to capture attention, then rode the wave for clicks and ad buys. She contacted the regional office and asked whether a crew had requested permission that day, and the answer came back tidy and negative. The office asked for details, and Renata kept her language cool and focused on logs and times. She included the masked call and the quiet shelf, and the fact that a brimmed hat appeared where a plan would benefit from a dramatic turn. She asked for guidance on whether to treat the case as a welfare check or as a permit violation with a side of false alarm. Before the office replied, Wyatt flagged a new detail from the camera stills that had felt unimportant earlier. The brimmed hat in the second still carried a small pin that caught the sun, and the same pin appeared on the media badge in the spring photo. It was a tiny compass rose with 3 points bent, a logo for a training program that marketed grit and quiet strength. The pin created a line between online identity and trail identity, often a line people try to blur when views are currency. The volunteer team returned from the upper spur with a clean report and no sign of distress along the ridge. A group of teenagers said they watched a drone rise above the bridge and glide toward the shelf, then return quickly when someone shouted about rules. The teenagers filmed the drone on a phone, and the video captured the brimmed hat figure leaning on the railing, then turning away when the shout landed. Renata saved the clip and documented the time, then asked the group to leave contact details in case the office needed follow-up. As evening lights softened, dispatch called with a quiet advisory. A patrol unit had found a silver sedan parked at a scenic turnout 15 miles east, empty and cooling, with a folded jacket in the back. The officer waited nearby without lights and reported a second vehicle pulling in close, then leaving when the cruiser rolled forward. The plate on the second car belonged to a rental agency with a flexible policy about credit cards, a detail Renata captured without judgment. The office finally replied and advised a welfare check with a parallel inquiry into misuse of emergency channels. They recommended a measured approach that prioritized safety and avoided public drama. Renata agreed, and then called the brother again and asked him to come to the station, explaining that in-person rooms make details easier to manage. He arrived with shoulders high and hands careful, and he looked like someone who disliked being on the wrong side of a counter. He admitted the channel sometimes staged challenges, and that his sister had pitched a solo speed test that needed daylight and a sense of risk. He insisted that no real danger was planned, only a late check-in, followed by a triumphant return and a lesson about preparation. He said a friend reportedly stood by with water near the highway, and the masked call was about closures because crowds ruined dramatic timing. He said he panicked when she missed the planned text by a full hour and called the station because the bit felt wrong. Renata listened and typed, then asked to speak with the sister by phone. The brother made a call on speaker, and the brimmed hat answered with a small breath, then a quick apology that sounded practiced. She said she was safe and nearby, and that she feared trouble once she realized how many people had watched the bridge. She agreed to meet at the station within 30 minutes and added that the shelf was a mistake because the rock felt greasy and mean. She arrived with salt on her face and a steady gaze, 34, freelance trainer and editor for a mid-sized channel. She wore the pin on the brim and kept her hands open on the counter, then gave a full account that matched much of the timeline. She described the shelf and the alcove and admitted the staged silence to build tension for a cut. She said the drone operator backed out when a shout scared him and that the grocery stop was a pause to decide whether to end the bit early. Renata walked her through the consequences with a calm voice and clear steps. They would log the misuse of the term missing in the station ledger and forward a report on the masked call to the office. They would recommend a fine for the drone flight near the bridge and review the permit files for the transposed name entry. They would also offer a voluntary donation to the volunteer team for the hours spent and recommend a public safety note if the channel posted any edited footage. The woman nodded and said she understood, then asked whether the station planned to call the county. Renata said the county dispatch already sat in the loop and had agreed to remain cooperative as long as the channel avoided inflaming viewers. She added that the station took missing reports seriously because moments consume resources, and that even staged quiet pressures real systems. The woman agreed to record a clear statement and accepted a brochure on safe filming that looked oddly gentle in the harsh light. Wyatt stepped outside and watched the last cars roll out of the lot, and the air finally cooled enough to feel kind. The dog from earlier barked once from a passing truck, and the fisherman from the creek lifted 2 fingers without slowing. Renata filed the forms and wrote a final note that tied the shelf to the old rescues and the pin to the badge and the masked call to timing. The station lights hummed and the clock hands slid past 6, then found their mark without ceremony. By the time the brother and sister left, the word missing on the duty sheet had a line through it. Renata kept the original note card with the magnet hole because records tell stories when memory wants to embellish. The office would likely call tomorrow and ask for clarifications, and the drone policy would probably gain a new sentence. She felt the usual mix of relief and irritation that follows a false alarm, and the strange sympathy for people who turn risk into currency. Later, the channel posted a short video that downplayed the panic, and the comments argued about rules and grit. The station received 2 thank you emails from hikers who heard the news secondhand and a complaint from a person who disliked the fines on principle. Renata archived the messages and watered the plant on the windowsill, then wrote one more line in the log about the shelf that was not a shortcut. The sentence ended with a plain warning that noon creates flat shadows and false confidence, a small truth inside a larger one. In quiet moments after a shift like that, she believed most people want a story that forgives them. Trails do not forgive, they teach. And the classroom never closes just because cameras blink. The station would open again at 7, and the clipboard would carry new names, and the clock would tick in the same steady way. Somewhere on the ridge, a jay would scold the wind, and the shelf would wait with its narrow promise, ready to turn bravado into paperwork. The stories. Why this librarian reopened a cold map drawer. In late September of 2014, the Quiet Town Library off Route 47 got a new head librarian named Corinne Ashland. She was 39, a former archivist who'd spent years cataloging geological surveys for a state university. By all accounts, Corinne wasn't the kind of person to chase ghosts until the day she decided to reopen an old, locked map drawer that everyone else had forgotten. The drawer sat in the basement stacks, labeled Time State Topography 1952 to 1958 asterisk. Its brass handle had gone dull with age, and the key was missing. For years, staff used the cabinet as a makeshift table for coffee mugs and boxes of donations. But one morning, while rearranging a shipment of donated atlases, Corinne noticed a faint rust-colored smear near the label. It looked like dried clay or maybe iron dust. Either way, it didn't belong there. She mentioned it to her assistant, and he laughed, saying, "That drawer's cursed. Ask Mrs. Langley. She swears a surveyor disappeared working on those maps." Corinne smiled politely, but something in her stayed hooked on the idea. She asked around. The drawer dated back to when the building served as a records annex for the county planning office. In the mid-50s, several regional floodplain studies were stored there before the files were relocated or supposedly relocated to the state archives. No one ever verified that. When Corinne checked the archive's digital inventory, she found gaps. 4 missing surveys, all from the same year, 1957. They covered a stretch of riverland that was later condemned for a hydroelectric project that never materialized. That evening, Corinne used a universal key set kept for restoration work and opened the map drawer for the first time in decades. Inside were rolled parchments bound with cotton strings, their edges yellowed. Beneath them, she found a tin box wrapped in wax paper. Inside the box lay a water-stained notebook, a compass with a cracked lens, and a faded photograph of 2 men standing beside a field the size of a football stadium, ringed by survey poles. On the back of the photo, someone had written, asterisk, last day before the dig, GM asterisk. Corinne scanned the initials against old employment rosters. There was a Gregory Malon, a field engineer who'd gone missing in June of 1958. Officially, he'd left the project for family reasons, but the local paper from that summer told a stranger story. Asterisk, surveyor vanishes near proposed reservoir site. Search suspended after 3 days. Asterisk, no follow-up, no body recovered. Corinne started a file. 1. She called the county records department. A man named Leland Cross, an aging clerk who'd worked there since the 70s, remembered something. Mahlon. Yeah? He was working on the Franklin Bend plan. Whole thing got shelved when the funding dried up. I heard his partner quit soon after. Leland didn't recall the partner's name, but he mentioned an old storage trailer the county once kept near the riverbank. They hauled the trailer out after a flood in the 60s, he said. If anything survived, it's in the historical depot now. The depot was just a few miles away. Corinne drove there that weekend, signed in as a researcher, and requested the Franklin Bend materials. The clerk brought her a warped cardboard box smelling of mildew. Inside were soil samples, invoices, and a reel of magnetic tape marked Audio Log 4 field notes. She had to borrow an old player from the depot staff, The recording was faint, but clear enough to recognize two male voices. Asterisk, Greg, you're not logging this, right? Asterisk, asterisk. Relax. It's just us. But if this ridge keeps sinking, we need to report it. Asterisk. Relax. Relax. Asterisk. Asterisk. We will. After the last survey, the company can't afford another delay. Asterisk. The tape ended with wind noise and a scrape, like a microphone hitting dirt. Corinne replayed it 3 times, listening for landmarks. At one point, one of them mentioned mile marker 12 and the culvert by the sycamores. Using digitized topographic maps, she traced those features to a narrow bend along the river, now fenced off as private land. When she brought this to the local sheriff's office, the deputy shrugged. If you're talking about MrBallen, that case is older than my dad. We can't go digging around on private property for a rumor. But Corinne wasn't chasing rumor. She was following evidence. She emailed a geologist friend from her university days, Dr. Theo Ricks, who specialized in landslide patterns. Theo ran a ground-penetrating radar survey along that same bend under a research permit for soil erosion. The data showed a deep subsidence pocket about 20 feet from the current riverline, consistent with an old collapsed tunnel. Theo sent her the printout and a note, asterisk, you might have just found their camp trench. Asterisk. They returned together a week later. Theo handled the radar equipment while Corinne recorded the coordinates. Near sunset, a small piece of metal surfaced from the silt, a corroded survey tripod leg, stamped Property of Franklin Bend Hydro Limited. The find was modest, but it confirmed the crew had worked exactly where she predicted. From that point, Corinne began piecing the timeline. The notebook from the tin box mentioned sudden soil shifts, pressure readings, and the phrase asterisk, map variance, river shift, not natural. Asterisk. The handwriting was MrBallen's, matching samples from his earlier reports. It appeared he suspected someone had deliberately diverted a drainage channel to falsify flood risk data, possibly to inflate land value before government acquisition. If true, exposing it could have derailed the whole project. The company had millions at stake. MrBallen filed his last note 2 days before he vanished. Corinne cross-checked the company records and found the corporation dissolved in 1961, right after a quiet lawsuit settlement with an undisclosed party. No public record linked it to MrBallen. But tucked inside the notebook's back cover, hidden beneath the lining, she found a short letter addressed to M.R. Hanley, attorney at law. It never got mailed. The ink was blurred but readable enough. Asterisk, they moved the stakes. If anything happens, check the revised map in drawer C. It's the only truth left. Asterisk. Drawer C was the one she'd opened. By early winter, local journalists picked up her findings. The county authorized a limited excavation, mainly to verify the historic maps. When workers dug near the subsidence pocket, they uncovered remnants of an old metal barrel containing drafting tools and fragments of canvas. Among them was a wristwatch, glass shattered, still faintly engraved, asterisk GM, asterisk dental fragments. Nearby, later confirmed MrBallen's identity. The discovery didn't just solve a missing person case, it revealed a quiet cover-up. The original floodplain data, preserved in those maps, showed the river was unstable long before developers planned the reservoir. Ignoring it had likely saved the investors short-term losses, but cost one man his life. The county issued a formal acknowledgement of error, though no one alive faced charges. The land was later rezoned as a conservation area. Corinne kept working at the library, though people now came from all over asking about the librarian who solved the map mystery. She never took credit beyond saying she just followed what was left behind. The old drawer was cleaned, cataloged, and displayed behind glass with the tin box and the compass inside. Every so often, she'd unlock the case to polish the brass handle, and she'd think about MrBallen's note, the way he wrote Time's the only truth left, asterisk. She understood now that archives aren't just about paper or ink, they're about the things people try to bury, and the few who still choose to look. By the next spring, The library basement smelled of fresh paint. The drawer sat quietly in its corner, again, cool metal against the hum of fluorescent lights. And that was enough. No headlines, no dramatics, just a reminder that sometimes reopening the past isn't about curiosity. It's about letting someone finally be found.